I never thought clearing snow would land me in the biggest legal battle of my life. But that's exactly what happened when Patricia Whitmore decided to fine me $2,000 for being a good neighbor. My name is Quentin Sanderson, and I've lived in Meadowbrook Heights, a planned community just outside of Portland, Oregon, for 6 years. The neighborhood sits tucked away in the suburbs of Beaverton, with rows of identical townhomes painted in various shades of beige and gray. When I bought my place back in 2019, the HOA seemed reasonable enough. Monthly fees were manageable, the community pool stayed clean, and the landscaping looked decent. I should have known better. HOAs have a way of attracting power-hungry people who treat their position like they're running a small dictatorship. The trouble started in January 2026, during one of those rare Oregon snowstorms that dumps half a foot of powder on everyone and brings the entire city to a standstill. Most people don't realize that Portland doesn't handle snow well. We don't have enough plows, people don't know how to drive in it, and the whole place basically shuts down when white stuff falls from the sky. I woke up that Saturday morning to find everything covered in thick snow. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman in her 70s, lived 3 doors down. She had mentioned the week before that her son was visiting from San Francisco and would be staying with her for a few days. I knew she'd need help getting out if there was an emergency, so after clearing my own driveway and walkway, I grabbed my shovel and headed down the row of townhomes. The community has these shared walkways between units, and they connect to emergency exit doors in the back of each building. Our townhomes are set up in clusters of 8 units, with 4 on each side sharing a central corridor. Fire code requires these exits to remain accessible at all times. I'd read the building regulations when I bought the place because I actually cared about safety. The snow had piled up against these emergency doors, completely blocking them. If there was a fire, people would be trapped. I spent 3 hours that morning clearing snow from the emergency exits, the main walkways, and helping Mrs. Chen with her driveway. My back ached, my hands were freezing despite my gloves, and I'd worked up a decent sweat despite the cold. When I finally trudged back to my place, I felt good about what I'd done. I'd helped my neighbors and made the community safer. That feeling lasted exactly 4 days. On Wednesday, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. The return address showed it was from the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. I tore it open right there, standing in the cold January air with my breath making little clouds. The letter stated that I was being fined $2,000 for unauthorized maintenance work and violating Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws regarding contracted services. I read it 3 times, certain I was missing something. According to Patricia Whitmore, the HOA president, only the contracted snow removal company was permitted to clear snow from common areas. By doing it myself, I had violated their exclusive contract and created liability issues. $2,000 for clearing snow from emergency exits. I called the HOA office immediately. A bored-sounding woman named Jennifer answered and transferred me to Patricia's voicemail. I left a message explaining the situation, emphasizing the blocked emergency exits and the safety hazard. I kept my tone professional, assuming this was just a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple conversation. Patricia called me back the next day while I was at work. I'm a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing plant in Hillsborough, and I was in the middle of reviewing some technical drawings when my phone buzzed. "Mr. Sanderson, this is Patricia Whitmore from the HOA," she said in a clipped, nasal voice that immediately set my teeth on edge. "I received your message regarding the fine." "Yes, "Thank you for calling back," I said, stepping out of the office into the hallway for privacy. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was just clearing snow from the emergency exits because they were completely blocked. It's a safety issue." "Mr. Sanderson, the bylaws are very clear. Section 7.3 states that all maintenance of common areas must be performed by contracted professionals. We have a snow removal company on retainer for exactly this purpose. But they hadn't shown up yet, and the emergency exits were blocked. That's against fire code. The company had 48 hours to respond under their contract. You cleared the snow after only," I heard papers rustling, "approximately 18 hours. You violated the contract and created a liability issue for the association." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A liability issue. I was preventing a liability issue. If there had been a fire and someone couldn't get out because the exits were blocked, the HOA would have been sued into oblivion. "That's not your concern, Mr. Sanderson. You're not qualified to make those determinations. The fine stands. You have 30 days to pay or we'll place a lien on your property." "This is insane. I'm not paying $2,000 for clearing snow from emergency exits." "Then I suggest you review Section 12.8 regarding dispute resolution. You can request a hearing with the HOA board." "Good day, Mr. Sanderson." She hung up before I could respond. I stood in that hallway, staring at my phone, feeling my blood pressure rising. I'd lived a pretty drama-free life up until that point. I paid my bills, did my job, helped my neighbors when I could. The idea that I was being punished for doing the right thing felt fundamentally wrong. That evening, I dug out my copy of the HOA bylaws. It was a thick document, maybe 80 pages of dense legal language. I'd skimmed it when I bought the place but never read it thoroughly. Now I went through it line by line, highlighting relevant sections. Section 7.3 did indeed state that common area maintenance had to be performed by contracted professionals. But Section 4.2 also stated that the HOA shall maintain all common areas in compliance with applicable local, state, and federal regulations, including but not limited to fire and safety codes. Section 4.2 seemed to supersede 7.3 in my mind, but I wasn't a lawyer. I found Section 12.8, which outlined the dispute resolution process. I could request a hearing within 15 days of receiving a fine. The board would review the case and make a final determination. If I disagreed with their decision, I could pursue the matter in civil court, but I'd have to pay the HOA's legal fees if I lost. I spent the weekend researching Oregon fire codes and HOA law. The more I read, the more convinced I became that I was in the right. The International Fire Code, which Oregon has adopted, requires that emergency exits remain unobstructed at all times. Property owners have an affirmative duty to maintain safe egress. The HOA couldn't contract away their legal obligations. On Monday, I drafted a formal letter requesting a hearing. I cited the relevant fire codes, explained the safety hazard, and argued that Section 4.2 of the bylaws required the HOA to maintain code compliance, which I had helped them do. I submitted it to the HOA office and waited. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening at 7. It would take place in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that housed the pool equipment and a meeting room. During those 3 weeks, I talked to my neighbors about what had happened. Mrs. Chen was horrified when she heard about the fine. Her son had already gone back to California, but she called him, and he offered to write a letter supporting me. I thanked her but said I'd wait to see how the hearing went. Most of my neighbors were sympathetic but cautious. Nobody wanted to get on Patricia's bad side. I learned that she'd been HOA president for 8 years and ran the board with an iron fist. She was a real estate agent in her mid-50s who seemed to view the HOA as her personal kingdom. People told me stories about her fining residents for having the wrong color curtains visible from the street, for parking in their own driveways past 10 at night, and for letting their grass grow a quarter-inch too tall. One neighbor, a guy named Marcus who lived in the unit next to mine, told me about how Patricia had fined him $500 for putting up a bird feeder in his backyard. Apparently, bird feeders attracted rodents, which violated the pest control section of the bylaws. Marcus had taken the feeder down and paid the fine because he didn't want the hassle. "You're not going to win," Marcus told me as we talked in my driveway one evening. "Patricia always wins. The board rubber stamps whatever she wants. Your best bet is to pay the fine and move on." "I'm not paying $2,000 for clearing snow," I said. "It's the principle of the thing." "Principles are expensive in an HOA," Marcus said, shaking his head. The night of the hearing, I arrived at the community center 15 minutes early. I brought a folder with printouts of the relevant fire codes, photos I'd taken of the blocked emergency exits before clearing them, and my copy of the bylaws with the relevant sections highlighted. The meeting room was small and depressing, with fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered. A folding table sat at the front of the room with 5 chairs behind it. Rows of plastic chairs faced the table. I took a seat in the front row and waited. Patricia arrived exactly at 7, along with the other 4 board members. I recognized 2 of them from around the neighborhood. There was Gerald Morrison, a retired accountant who lived near the pool, Sandra Fitzpatrick, a middle-aged woman who worked as a paralegal, Tom Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen who was some kind of consultant, and Denise Hamilton, who I'd heard was a teacher. Patricia took the center seat. She was a tall woman with highlighted blonde hair styled in that aggressively practical cut that screams middle management. She wore a burgundy blazer over a white blouse and had reading glasses on a chain around her neck. "This hearing will come to order," Patricia said, banging a gavel on the table. Where she'd gotten a gavel, I had no idea. "We're here to address the dispute filed by Mr. Quentin Sanderson regarding a fine issued on January 14, 2026. Mr. Sanderson, you have 10 minutes to present your case." I stood and walked to a small podium that had been set up facing the board. I laid out my folder and took a breath. "Thank you for hearing me tonight. On January 10th, we had significant snowfall. By the morning of January 11th, the emergency exits in our section of the community were completely blocked by snow. These exits are required by fire code to remain accessible at all times." I held up one of the photos showing snow piled up against an emergency door. "As you can see, there was no way anyone could have used these exits in an emergency." I continued, explaining how I'd cleared the snow after ensuring my own property was safe, how I'd helped an elderly neighbor, and how I'd done it all out of concern for community safety. I cited the International Fire Code sections about egress requirements and pointed out Section 4.2 of our own bylaws requiring code compliance. The contracted snow removal company has 48 hours to respond under their agreement with the HOA. That might be acceptable for clearing parking lots or sidewalks, but it's not acceptable for emergency exits. Every hour those exits remained blocked, we were all in violation of fire code and at risk if there was an emergency. I didn't clear the snow to undermine the HOA or violate any contracts. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because Section 4.2 of our bylaws requires the HOA to maintain code compliance. I finished with 2 minutes to spare. Patricia looked unmoved, her lips pressed into a thin line. Thank you, Mr. Sanderson. The board will now deliberate. Don't I get to hear your side? I asked. Isn't there supposed to be a discussion? The facts are clear, Mr. Sanderson. You violated Section 7.3. Please take your seat. I sat down, frustration building in my chest. The board members leaned together and whispered for maybe 3 minutes. It was obviously for show. They'd made up their minds before I'd even walked in. Patricia straightened and adjusted her glasses. The board has reached a decision. Mr. Sanderson, while we appreciate your concerns about safety, the bylaws exist for a reason. If we allow homeowners to decide for themselves when they can perform maintenance on common areas, we'll have chaos. The snow removal company is insured and bonded. When you performed this work, you created a liability for the association. If you had injured yourself, you could have sued us. The fine is upheld. You have 25 days remaining to remit payment. This is ridiculous, I said, standing up. You're punishing me for following fire code. The fire code allows up to 48 hours for snow removal in non-critical situations, Patricia said. The contracted company was well within their window. Emergency exits are critical situations. Your opinion is noted, Mr. Sanderson. If you wish to pursue this further, you may file in civil court. This hearing is adjourned. She banged the gavel again. I left the community center furious. The whole thing had been a joke, a performance to check a box. Patricia had no intention of overturning the fine. As I drove home, I kept thinking about what Marcus had said. Patricia always wins, but I wasn't Marcus. I wasn't going to just roll over. Over the next few days, I consulted with a lawyer. Her name was Rebecca Walsh, and she specialized in HOA disputes. Her office was in downtown Portland, in one of those old buildings with character that hadn't been converted into overpriced condos yet. Rebecca was in her 40s, sharp and professional. She listened to my story, reviewed the documents I'd brought, and then leaned back in her chair. You're right about the fire code, she said. The HOA has a legal obligation to maintain safe egress. However, HOA law in Oregon gives associations broad authority to enforce their bylaws. A judge might see this as a legitimate enforcement action, even if it seems unreasonable. So I'm screwed? Not necessarily. The problem is that litigation is expensive. Even if you win, you might spend $5,000 or $10,000 in legal fees. And if you lose, you'll have to pay their legal fees too, plus the original fine. Is this worth potentially $15,000 to you? I thought about it. $15,000 was a lot of money. But the principle mattered. If I backed down, Patricia would keep doing this to other people. She'd keep abusing her authority, knowing nobody would stand up to her. What if I don't pay the fine? I asked. They'll place a lien on your property. Eventually, they could even foreclose if the debt gets large enough with accumulating fees and interest. I've seen HOAs foreclose over a few $1,000s in unpaid fines. They're legally entitled to do it. So my options are pay a fine, spend a fortune fighting it in court, or lose my home. Essentially, yes. I'm sorry. HOA law is heavily weighted in favor of the associations. The theory is that people agreed to the bylaws when they bought their property, so they're bound by them. I left Rebecca's office feeling defeated. The system was rigged. Patricia could fine me for anything, and there was basically nothing I could do about it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the emergency exits, about the fire code, about Patricia's smug face when she upheld the fine. And then something occurred to me. If the HOA was going to fine me for clearing the emergency exits, then fine. I wouldn't clear them anymore. That was their job, according to Section 7.3. I'd let them handle it. The forecast showed more snow coming the following week. Portland was having an unusually harsh winter, with storm after storm rolling in from the Pacific. When the snow came, I'd clear my own driveway and walkway and nothing else. Let's see how Patricia liked it when those emergency exits stayed blocked for the full 48 hours allowed under the snow removal contract. It was petty, sure, but sometimes petty is all you've got. The next storm hit on a Tuesday night, dropping another 8 inches by Wednesday morning. I woke up, looked at the snow, and got dressed. I cleared my own driveway and the walkway immediately in front of my door. Then I stopped. The emergency exit near my unit was buried under snow. I took a photo with my phone, noting the timestamp, and went inside. I worked from home that day, checking periodically to see if the snow removal company showed up. They didn't come Wednesday. They didn't come Wednesday night. By Thursday morning, it had been almost 36 hours and the emergency exits were still blocked. Mrs. Chen called me Thursday afternoon. "Quentin, I can't get out my back door. There's so much snow. Can you help me clear it?" "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen. The HOA fined me $2,000 for clearing snow last time. I can't risk another fine. You should call the HOA office and ask them to send the contracted company." There was a pause. "They fined you for helping me." "They fined me for clearing the emergency exits and common walkways." Said it violated their contract with the snow removal company. "That's terrible. You were just being a good neighbor." "I agree, but the HOA board didn't see it that way. I'm really sorry, but I can't help this time." I felt guilty as I hung up, but I reminded myself that this was the HOA's policy. They wanted only the contracted company touching the common areas. Fine. Let them deal with the consequences. The snow removal company finally showed up Thursday evening, about 44 hours after the snow had stopped falling. I watched from my window as 2 guys with shovels and a small plow made their way through the complex. They cleared the parking lot and the main sidewalks but barely touched the areas around the emergency exits. They did a cursory pass, leaving several inches of compressed snow and ice. I took more photos and made notes. Another storm came the following week. Same pattern. I cleared only my own immediate area and left everything else alone. The emergency exits stayed blocked for nearly 48 hours again. This time, 3 different neighbors called asking for help. I told them all the same thing: call the HOA. By the 3rd storm, word had spread through the neighborhood about what was happening. People were upset. The emergency exits were remaining blocked for days after each snowfall. The contracted company was doing the bare minimum, and Patricia was still demanding I pay the $2,000 fine. I got a follow-up letter from the HOA in early February. The fine had now increased to $2,500 with added late fees and administrative charges. They demanded payment within 10 days or they'd file a lien. I ignored it. Then something happened that I didn't expect. On February 15th, we had another major storm, maybe the biggest of the winter. Snow fell continuously for 2 days, and by Saturday morning we had over a foot of accumulation. The power went out in parts of the neighborhood, including in my section. I was at home when I heard shouting outside. I looked out to see smoke coming from one of the units 3 buildings over. People were running out the front doors in their pajamas, but one of the rear emergency exits was blocked by snow. I could see someone inside, an older man, trying to push the door open. The snow was packed too deep. I grabbed my shovel and ran. By the time I got there, flames were visible in a second-floor window. The man was still trying to force the door, panic on his face. I started digging as fast as I could, throwing snow aside in huge chunks. 2 other neighbors joined me, and we managed to clear enough space for the man to push through. He stumbled out, coughing, his face covered in soot. His name was Arthur Freeman, and he lived alone. The fire department arrived about 10 minutes later, but by then the unit was badly damaged. Arthur was taken to the hospital for smoke inhalation. He recovered, but he'd lost almost everything in the fire. The investigation determined that a space heater had tipped over during the power outage, igniting some bedding. Here's where things got interesting. Arthur's daughter, Nicole, was an attorney in Seattle. When she found out that the emergency exit had been blocked by snow for over 48 hours, and that I'd been fined for clearing similar blockages in the past, she lost her mind. Nicole came to Portland the week after the fire. She was in her early 30s, professionally dressed and absolutely furious. She knocked on my door on a Wednesday evening. "Mr. Sanderson, I'm Nicole Freeman, Arthur's daughter. You have a few minutes to talk." I invited her in and made coffee while she set up a laptop at my kitchen table. For the next hour, I told her everything. The original fine, the hearing, the subsequent storms, my decision to stop clearing the snow, the photos I'd taken documenting the blocked exits. "This is criminal negligence," Nicole said, typing notes rapidly. "The HOA has a legal duty to maintain safe egress. They knew the exits were being blocked. They did nothing. My father nearly died because of their inaction." "I'm sorry about your father," I said. "I wanted to clear the snow, I tried to, but they fined me $2,000 for doing it." "I want to sue them," Nicole said bluntly. "The HOA, Patricia Whitmore personally, and the snow removal company, but I need your testimony and your documentation. Are you willing to be involved?" "Absolutely." Nicole filed the lawsuit 2 weeks later. She sued the HOA for negligence, Patricia Whitmore personally for gross negligence in her capacity as board president, and the snow removal company for breach of contract. She was seeking damages for Arthur's medical bills, his lost property, and emotional distress. The complaint also asked for punitive damages and requested that the court appoint an independent manager to oversee the HOA. The local news picked up the story. Suddenly, reporters were calling me, asking about the fine, about the blocked emergency exits, about Patricia Whitmore. I did one interview with a local TV station, and it aired during the evening news. The headline was, "HOA Fines Good Samaritan, Leaves Emergency Exits Blocked." The publicity was brutal for Patricia and the HOA. Neighbors who'd been afraid to speak up suddenly came forward with their own stories about unreasonable fines and Patricia's authoritarian management style. The story went semi-viral online, showing up on HOA horror story forums and Reddit threads. Patricia tried to do damage control. She sent out a letter to all residents explaining that the fine was about maintaining professional standards and that the blocked exits were the snow removal company's fault, not the HOA's. But it was too late. The narrative had been set. In March, the HOA's insurance company got involved. They sent investigators to interview residents and review documentation. I spent 2 hours talking to an investigator named Craig Stevens, walking him through everything. He took copies of all my photos and notes. A week later, the insurance company dropped the HOA's liability coverage. They sent a letter stating that the association had demonstrated a pattern of negligent disregard for safety standards, and that they were declining to renew the policy. Without insurance, the HOA couldn't operate. Banks wouldn't hold their reserve accounts, and they couldn't hire contractors. The board called an emergency meeting. Patricia tried to blame me, saying that my refusal to clear the snow had caused the whole problem, but the other board members had finally had enough. Gerald Morrison, the retired accountant, actually stood up and told Patricia she was out of control. "You fined a man for following fire code," Gerald shouted. You prioritized a snow removal contract over resident safety. Arthur Freeman nearly died. Quentin has been vindicated in the press, and now we can't get insurance. This is your fault, Patricia. The board voted 4-1 to remove Patricia as president and to rescind my fine. Patricia voted against both measures, but she was outvoted. They also voted to settle Nicole's lawsuit, though the terms weren't made public. But Nicole wasn't satisfied with a settlement. She wanted accountability. She took the evidence to the Beaverton Police Department and filed a complaint. She argued that Patricia's actions rose to the level of criminal negligence under Oregon law. Specifically, she cited ORS 163.195, which defines criminal negligence as failing to be aware of a substantial and unjustifiable risk. I didn't think anything would come of it. Police rarely get involved in HOA disputes. But Nicole was persistent, and the publicity around the case put pressure on the authorities to at least investigate. Detective Maria Rodriguez was assigned to the case. She interviewed me in April, taking a statement about the timeline of events. She also interviewed Arthur, Nicole, several neighbors, and members of the snow removal company. She subpoenaed HOA records and emails. What she found was damning. In the emails, Patricia had been explicitly warned by other board members about the blocked emergency exits. Sandra Fitzpatrick, the paralegal on the board, had sent multiple emails pointing out that fire code required the exits to remain clear, and that 48 hours was too long. Patricia had responded dismissively, saying that the contracted company was sufficient and that we can't have homeowners taking matters into their own hands. Even worse, the snow removal company had sent an email to Patricia in late January saying they were understaffed and couldn't meet the 48-hour window consistently. Patricia had acknowledged the email but taken no action. She hadn't hired a supplemental company or made any changes to the contract. She just ignored the problem. Detective Rodriguez presented the evidence to the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. In May, they decided to file charges. Patricia Whitmore was charged with 2 counts of reckless endangerment and 1 count of criminal negligence. The charges carried potential jail time, though everyone expected she'd get probation if convicted. The arraignment was in June. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom. Patricia showed up with a lawyer, a slick guy in an expensive suit. She pleaded not guilty, and the judge set a trial date for September. The trial was a spectacle. The prosecution called Arthur Freeman, who testified emotionally about his terror when the emergency exit wouldn't open, about thinking he was going to die in the fire. They called me, and I explained the timeline of the fines, the hearing, and my decision to stop clearing the snow after being penalized for it. The defense argued that Patricia had relied on the contracted company and couldn't be held criminally responsible for their failures. They painted her as a volunteer doing her best to manage a community and being scapegoated for a tragic accident. But the emails killed her defense. When the prosecution introduced the messages showing that Patricia had been explicitly warned about the problems and had done nothing, the jury's attitude visibly shifted. You could see it on their faces. This wasn't someone who'd made an innocent mistake. This was someone who'd put her ego and authority ahead of people's safety. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Patricia Whitmore guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was in October. The judge gave her 90 days in jail, suspended except for 10 days, 3 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board in Oregon. She was also ordered to pay restitution to Arthur Freeman for his medical expenses and lost property, which totaled about $35,000. I watched Patricia's face as the sentence was read. She looked stunned, like she couldn't believe this was happening to her. For 8 years, she'd been in charge, wielding her authority without consequences. Now she was a convicted criminal. The HOA had to rebuild after the scandal. The board appointed Gerald Morrison as interim president, and they hired a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations. They rewrote sections of the bylaws to prioritize safety over contract compliance, and established a procedure for homeowners to take emergency action when the HOA or its contractors failed to address immediate hazards. They also formally apologized to me at a community meeting and returned the $2,500 I'd never paid, plus an additional $5,000 as compensation for the hassle. I hadn't asked for the money, but I wasn't going to refuse it either. The snow removal contract was terminated, and they hired a new company with better response times and a specific requirement to clear emergency exits within 12 hours of snowfall ending. Arthur Freeman recovered fully and moved in with Nicole in Seattle. He didn't want to stay in the townhome after the fire, which was understandable. Nicole dropped the civil lawsuit after the HOA settled with her father privately. I heard the settlement was substantial, though the exact amount was confidential. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. The story faded from the news. People stopped recognizing me from the TV interview. I went back to work, came home, lived my life. But I learned something important through all of this. HOAs operate with very little oversight. They have incredible power over people's homes and lives, and that power attracts people who like control. Patricia wasn't an anomaly. There are Patricia Whitmores all over the country, making people's lives miserable because they can. The key is documentation and persistence. I took photos. I kept records. I didn't back down when it would have been easier to just pay the fine and move on. And when things escalated, I had the evidence to prove I was right. Marcus, my neighbor who told me I couldn't win, apologized after everything was over. "I was wrong," he said. "You did the right thing. I wish I'd stood up to her years ago." I appreciated that, but I didn't blame him. Standing up to authority is hard, especially when it affects your home and your financial security. Most people aren't in a position to take that risk. I got lucky that Nicole Freeman was an attorney willing to fight, and that the evidence was so clear. The broader lesson, though, is that communities need accountability. HOAs shouldn't be allowed to operate like mini dictatorships. There should be easier paths for homeowners to challenge unreasonable fines and actions. The current system makes it too expensive and risky for most people to push back. Several months after the trial ended, I was contacted by a state legislator who'd heard about the case. Representative David Yamamoto represented a district in the Portland area, and he'd been looking at HOA reform. He asked if I'd be willing to testify before a committee considering new regulations. I agreed. In November, I spent a morning at the state capitol in Salem, telling my story to a room full of legislators and staffers. Representative Yamamoto had drafted a bill that would require HOAs to prioritize life safety over contract enforcement, create an expedited dispute resolution process for safety-related issues, and establish penalties for HOA boards that violated fire and safety codes. The bill faced opposition from HOA industry groups, who argued it would make HOAs harder to manage and more vulnerable to lawsuits. But the publicity from my case and others gave the reform effort momentum. The bill passed the committee and moved forward. As of early 2026, the bill was still working its way through the legislature, but it looked like it would pass. If it did, Patricia's abuse of power would at least have resulted in some positive change. Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor, gave me a Christmas card that year. Inside, she'd written, "Thank you for being brave when others weren't. You made this community better." I put the card on my fridge where I saw it every day. The truth is, I didn't set out to be brave or to change anything. I just wanted to clear some snow and help my neighbors. The fact that such a simple, decent act turned into a criminal trial says a lot about how broken HOA governance can be. I still live in Meadowbrook Heights. I'm not planning to move. The new management company is actually responsive and reasonable. The community feels different now, more like actual neighbors looking out for each other rather than people living in fear of random fines. Last month, we had another snowstorm. It wasn't as bad as the ones from the previous winter, but it still dropped a few inches. I woke up that morning and cleared my driveway. Then, without really thinking about it, I grabbed my shovel and headed down to check the emergency exits. They'd already been cleared. The new snow removal company had done their job, but I was ready to do mine if needed. As I walked back to my townhome, I saw several neighbors outside clearing their own driveways. Marcus waved at me from across the parking lot. Mrs. Chen's niece, who'd moved into Mrs. Chen's place after she relocated to be closer to family, smiled and called out a greeting. It felt like a real community for the first time since I'd moved in. That evening, I got an email from Gerald Morrison, who was still serving as HOA president. The email went out to all residents, updating us on various community matters. At the end, there was a note. "Remember, if you see any safety hazards in common areas, please contact the management company immediately or, in emergencies, take appropriate action yourself. The safety of our community is everyone's responsibility." I smiled reading that. It was such a simple statement, such an obvious principle. But it had taken a $2,000 fine, a fire, a criminal trial, and months of turmoil to make it official policy. I thought about Patricia Whitmore sometimes, wondering if she understood what she'd done wrong. Probably not. People like her rarely do. They see themselves as defenders of order and rules, never recognizing when they've become petty tyrants. Her 10-day jail sentence had been served in March, and she was still on probation. I'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved out of Meadowbrook Heights shortly after the trial, selling her townhome at a loss because she couldn't stand facing the neighbors anymore. Someone said she'd relocated to Arizona. I hope she wasn't on any HOA boards down there. The restitution payments to Arthur Freeman were being made in monthly installments, supervised by the court. Patricia had apparently been forced to take a second mortgage on her new home to cover the costs. Part of me felt bad about that. Ruining someone's financial life is a heavy burden, even if they brought it on themselves. But then, I remembered Arthur's face when he testified about thinking he was going to die, and the sympathy faded. Actions have consequences. Patricia had spent years dishing out fines and penalties to residents for minor infractions, wielding her power without empathy or common sense. Now, she was experiencing consequences herself. In January 2027, almost exactly a year after the original incident, Representative Yamamoto's HOA reform bill passed the Oregon legislature and was signed into law by the governor. The new law, officially called the Homeowner Association Safety and Accountability Act, included most of the provisions Yamamoto had proposed. Key elements included a requirement that HOAs prioritize life safety over contract enforcement in all situations. If a homeowner took action to address an immediate safety hazard, the HOA couldn't fine them as long as the action was reasonable and necessary. an expedited dispute resolution process for safety-related issues, with a neutral arbitrator assigned within 10 days, and a decision required within 30 days. Criminal penalties for HOA board members who knowingly violated fire and safety codes, or who retaliated against residents for reporting safety violations. A requirement that all HOA board members in Oregon complete annual training on their legal responsibilities, including safety and accessibility requirements. A cap on fines at $500 for first-time violations, and a prohibition on adding administrative fees that exceeded the original fine amount. Representative Yamamoto invited me to the bill signing ceremony. I took a day off work and drove down to Salem. It was surreal standing in the governor's office, watching him sign the legislation while cameras flashed. In his brief remarks, the governor specifically mentioned my case and Arthur's fire as examples of why the reform was needed. Homeowners shouldn't have to choose between doing the right thing and facing financial ruin, the governor said. HOAs serve an important purpose in maintaining our communities, but they must be held to basic standards of reasonableness and safety. After the ceremony, I talked with some of the other people who'd advocated for the bill. There were homeowners from around the state with their own horror stories about abusive HOAs. One couple had been fined $10,000 for replacing their lawn with drought-resistant landscaping, even though their HOA's own rules supposedly allowed it. Another man had been threatened with foreclosure over a disagreement about whether his garage door was the correct shade of white. The common thread in all these stories was HOA boards drunk on their own authority, imposing arbitrary rules and crushing anyone who pushed back. The new law wouldn't solve everything, but it was a start. As spring arrived and the snow finally melted for good, life in Meadowbrook Heights continued its transformation. The professional management company instituted regular safety inspections of common areas. They held quarterly community meetings where residents could voice concerns. They even started a neighborhood watch program and organized a community barbecue in the summer. I volunteered for the safety committee, which was tasked with reviewing potential hazards and making recommendations to the board. It felt good to be part of the solution, rather than just the guy who'd exposed the problem. One of our first projects was installing better lighting around the emergency exits and painting the doors bright red so they'd be more visible. We also worked with the fire department to conduct a safety inspection of the entire complex. They found several violations beyond the snow-blocked exits. A few fire extinguishers that hadn't been serviced in years, some blocked fire lanes where residents regularly parked, and inadequate signage for emergency assembly areas. We fixed everything. It cost the HOA several $1,000s, but Gerald convinced the board that it was a necessary investment. "We already learned this lesson the hard way," he said at one meeting. "Let's not repeat it." By the time summer rolled around, Meadowbrook Heights felt like a genuinely nice place to live. Property values, which had dropped sharply after the negative publicity, started recovering. New residents moved in, and when they asked about the HOA, we could honestly say it was well managed and responsive. I even started to forget about the whole drama, letting it fade into just another chapter of my life. But then, in August, I got a letter from Nicole Freeman. She was writing to let me know that she'd taken a job with a nonprofit organization focused on HOA reform. The group, called Community Rights Alliance, worked to educate homeowners about their rights and to advocate for better regulations nationwide. Nicole was joining as their West Coast director. "Your willingness to stand up and fight made all of this possible," she wrote. The Oregon law is just the beginning. We're working on similar legislation in Washington and California. We're also developing resources to help homeowners document problems and navigate disputes. Thank you for being part of this movement. I wrote back, thanking her and wishing her well. It was gratifying to know that something positive had emerged from the chaos. That fall, I was contacted by a podcast that focuses on legal issues and true crime. They wanted to do an episode about my case. I was hesitant at first. I'd had enough publicity, but they convinced me that the story could help other people dealing with similar issues. The episode aired in October and became one of their most popular. I started getting emails and social media messages from people around the country, thanking me for speaking out and sharing their own HOA nightmares. Some of the stories were darkly funny, like the woman whose HOA had fined her for the color of her rose bushes. Others were genuinely tragic, like the veteran who'd been threatened with foreclosure because his PTSD made it hard for him to maintain his lawn to HOA standards. I tried to respond to as many messages as I could, offering advice and encouragement. The main thing I told people was to document everything, know their rights, and not be afraid to push back when the HOA was clearly wrong. In November, I got a message that caught me off guard. It was from someone claiming to be Patricia Whitmore's sister. She said Patricia had been diagnosed with a serious illness and wanted to apologize to me in person. She asked if I'd be willing to meet. I thought about it for several days. Part of me wanted nothing to do with Patricia. She'd caused me enormous stress and had endangered the entire community with her stubborn adherence to rules over safety. But another part of me was curious. And maybe, I thought, there was value in closure. I agreed to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Beaverton. Patricia's sister, whose name was Margaret, thanked me profusely and set up a time. Patricia looked different when I saw her. She'd lost weight, and her skin had a grayish tone. The illness was clearly taking a toll. She sat across from me with a cup of tea, her hands shaking slightly. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would. Your sister said you wanted to apologize." "I do." She took a sip of tea, gathering her thoughts. "I've had a lot of time to think this past year, about the trial, about what happened to Arthur, about you. I was wrong. About all of it. I didn't say anything, just waited. I got so caught up in the rules, in maintaining control, that I lost sight of why the rules existed in the first place. I told myself I was protecting the community, but really, I was just protecting my own authority. When you cleared that snow, it felt like a challenge to me personally. That's ridiculous, I know. You were just trying to help." "Yes, I was. Arthur Freeman almost died because of my stubbornness. That man, who'd done nothing wrong, almost burned to death because I was too proud to admit that the snow removal contract wasn't working. I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life." She paused, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did and I'm sorry. You were right and I was wrong. It's that simple." We sat in silence for a moment. I thought about all the anger I'd felt, all the stress and frustration, and I realized that holding on to it wasn't helping anyone. "I appreciate you saying that," I said finally. "It took courage to meet with me. It's the least I could do. I've been going to therapy, trying to understand why I acted the way I did. My therapist thinks it was about control. I had a difficult divorce about 10 years ago, and the HOA became the one place where I felt like I had power. But power without wisdom is just tyranny. I became a tyrant." "You hurt a lot of people," I said. "Not just me and Arthur. I heard stories from other residents about unreasonable fines, about living in fear of breaking some obscure rule. I know. I'm trying to make amends where I can. I've written letters to several people apologizing. Most haven't responded. I don't blame them. We talked for another 20 minutes. I learned that Patricia's illness was advanced cancer, that her prognosis wasn't good. She was undergoing treatment but trying to make peace with the possibility that she might not have much time left. As we prepared to leave, Patricia handed me an envelope. "What's this?" "A donation to Community Rights Alliance, the group Nicole Freeman joined. It's $5,000. I know it doesn't fix anything, but maybe it can help prevent other HOAs from making the same mistakes I did." I took the envelope, genuinely surprised. This is generous. It's necessary. "Take care, Quentin, and thank you for fighting back. Someone needed to." I watched her walk slowly to her car, Margaret supporting her arm. I felt a complicated mix of emotions: residual anger, surprise at her apology, sadness about her illness, and a strange sense of closure. I sent the donation to Nicole, explaining the circumstances. She called me a few days later. "That's remarkable," Nicole said. "People rarely take accountability like that. She's dying. Maybe that changes your perspective." "Maybe, but still, it takes courage to face the people you've wronged." I'm glad she did it. The donation funded a new initiative to create a database of HOA complaints and problems, allowing homeowners to research associations before buying property. It was a small step, but an important one. As 2027 drew to a close, I reflected on the past 2 years. It had been a wild, stressful, unexpected journey, all because I'd cleared some snow from emergency exits. But maybe that's how change happens. Not through grand gestures or planned movements, but through ordinary people refusing to accept injustice when they encounter it. I wasn't a hero or an activist. I was just a guy who thought blocking emergency exits was dangerous and wrong, and who refused to back down when punished for doing the right thing. The ripples from that decision spread far beyond anything I'd imagined. A state law changed. An advocacy organization got funded. A national conversation about HOA reform gained momentum. And a community learned that safety mattered more than rules. I still live in Meadowbrook Heights. I still clear snow when it falls from my driveway and anywhere else that needs it. And I sleep well at night, knowing that the emergency exits are clear and that my neighbors are safe. That's all I'd ever wanted in the first place. In February 2028, I got news that Patricia Whitmore had passed away. Margaret sent me an email letting me know. The funeral was private, just family. I sent flowers and a note expressing my condolences. Whatever else Patricia had been, she'd been a human being who'd made mistakes and at the end had tried to make them right. That counted for something. Life went on. I got a promotion at work. I started dating someone I met through the neighborhood community events. Mrs. Chen's niece became a good friend. The HOA continued to function smoothly under professional management, and whenever it snowed, I grabbed my shovel and cleared the emergency exits. Not because I had to, but because it was the right thing to do. And in the end, doing the right thing was all that mattered. The story of my fight with the HOA became something of a legend in the neighborhood. New residents heard about it during orientation meetings. Kids in the community knew me as the snow guy who'd stood up to the bad HOA lady. It was embarrassing sometimes, but also oddly satisfying, because if my stubbornness and willingness to fight had made even one person safer, then every stressful moment had been worth it.